What is up everyone? So with the release of Pokemon Home quite shortly after this video, or so we believe, I want to discuss my final thoughts on Generation 9, and then specifically Generation 9 monotypes and how it compares to Natdex monotypes Generation 9. So on the screen you're going to see a lot of stats, so if that's something that doesn't appeal to you, I would suggest clicking away from this video right now. If like me you're a big nerd for stats, well then stick around because we're going to be discussing quite a bit of it today. So first off, my main issue with Generation 9 has been the insane levels of power creep. New mons are extremely powerful, and this is the case for any generation, but I think this one has really gone above and beyond. We can see here the most used Pokemon in Generation 9 monotypes, and of the top 12 Pokemon, only 3 of them are not Generation 9 Pokemon, which is kind of crazy. 16% usage at the top in Flutter Mane and Dragapult does not look insane if you compare that to something like OU, where I believe Great Tusk was hitting almost 70 if not 80% usage at some stage. I don't think it was quite 80%, but I do remember seeing controversy on Twitter about Great Tusk hitting insanely high percentage usages. So that does sound quite on the low end of things in the grand scheme of things, 16%, but do bear in mind this is different in monotype as there's 18 types to choose from, and therefore things like Fluttermane and Dragapult are only usable on 2 types. So 2 of the 18 types can only use these Pokemon, and yet they're still seeing 16% usage, so we'll see a bit later on why that is actually extremely high. Now, I don't think power creep inherently itself is the issue. I think power creep is natural to every Pokemon generation, especially we've seen that since Generation 5. However, I do think we have somewhat unprecedented levels of power creep in Generation 9. In my opinion, some of the new Pokemon are insanely min-maxed for what they need to do, or some of the new moves are just crazy powerful as well. But as well as that, there's a bigger issue, and that's I think that only certain types got very much power crept tools. And if you're observant, you can probably look at this top 12 right now and see most of these would fit into either a dark or ghost team, and the odd fairy as well. And there's a reason for that. It's because the top tiers are fairly much completely dominated. We can see here usages for the metagame itself. It gives you a percent usage of each of the types. And the main 2 types that dominate the meta completely are Ghost and Dark. These are leading the meta by quite a huge margin, as we see here with Mono Water only at 8%, while Mono Dark at 11.7%. And you might think this is kind of pinching little numbers, that's not a huge difference. But in a perfectly balanced world, every type would have a roughly 5.5% usage. Of course, I'm not naive enough to think this would ever be possible in a meta. There's always going to be types that have low usage and some stronger types that have higher usage. But the higher deviation you have from that 5.5% mark, to me says it's a fairly unhealthy meta, and 12.25% is over twice obviously the 5.5, which in itself is looking quite bad in my opinion. On top of the really high usage we see in things like Dark and Ghost, we also see extremely low usage down here at the bottom tier, like Rock, Grass, Electric, Ice, even Steel, which is surprising. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about Steel being bad, I'm quite happy for it, but even still, all these types, I believe 10 types being below the average of 5.5% is not great. This isn't strictly new. Types always have pretty low usage on the lower end of the tiers, but unfortunately the top 3 types, if you include water as well, are quite stacked, with a significant jump from 6.7% to 8%. The rest of these kind of trickle up very slowly, which means I believe the top 3 dominate quite a lot. I believe that makes the meta quite stale over time. You're seeing a lot of the same types over and over again, and unfortunately this gap only widens the further up on the ladder you go. So in case you're curious, I'm using the 1500 ladder as the basis for doing this video, as I think it's kind of mid to high ladder, so it's a reasonable expectation of what players will be playing a lot of the time. The low ladder doesn't always necessarily reflect it, and not every player gets to the top ladder, so I think the 1500 mark is a better depiction of what most players have. But that said, if these types had great variety in Pokemon, would all be forgiven? No, not really, but at least I think things would be a little fresh. But we can actually see the usage of Pokemon on here, Dark, Ghost, and Fairy, and they're quite bad. The Pokemon themselves are also extremely stale, with Mons reaching over 80% usage on their teams, and the top 5 being well over the 50% mark, with Greninja being number 5 at 64% usage. That means the majority of these teams you're seeing are going to have often these 5 Pokemon, and very often case the same 6 Pokemon. You'll be fighting the same team again and again. This doesn't get better for Ghost here. In fact, the top 6 are used over 50% of the time, so oftentimes the case you'll be seeing the same team again and again. Sometimes more than half the time you'll be seeing it, and that's with the entirety of the Ghost teams you're seeing, which is quite a lot. Now, these stats are pretty definitive. They're on the Smogon website, but I can also say this firsthand. You might be watching my content before and thought, well, I don't play much Generation 9, so I'm just complaining for the sake of complaining and just reading numbers. Well, I actually have recently recorded a video of me playing 100 games of Monotype Generation 9 in a row. I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to release it yet. Let me know if you think I should. Maybe I will, but Pokemon Home will probably be out by the time I do. However, from first-hand experience, I've seen a lot of these types being used again. I've seen the same teams pop up again and again, and it gets very boring. I've also seen the argument, well, simple, just counter them. And this is okay if you are using one of the higher viability tiers, but as you go lower down the viability, some of those types get absolutely crushed and left in the dust with these extremely power-crept Mons. Flutter Mane alone comes to mind, and if we look here on Fairy, it boasts over 90% usage, which is essentially a must-pick, and that in itself, in my opinion, is really boring. Now, Fairy isn't used the most. We can see it here. It's only used 6.4% of the time. But when we do see it used, chances are good you're seeing Flutter Mane. And I do believe there are some types that just don't have reasonable answers to Flutter Mane. I've tried it on things like Fighting, and it gets absolutely crushed. Assault Vest, Lucario, in theory, can beat it, but you have to question, are you just counter-picking for the sake of counter-picking at that stage? And does that mon have any use outside of that? I do think it is quite an unhealthy meta overall. Is this an isolated incident as well? Sadly, it is not. While I only have information for the past few months, the trend does seem to be pretty set in stone. Here are the January stats where we see Mono Ghost and Mono Dark still dominating. The only difference is we see Mono Fighting being used quite a lot, probably to counter Mono Dark, but I said a second ago, this kind of fell off. We can see here, I believe it is here. Mono Fighting has fell off a small bit to 6.3% usage from 7.3% usage. Not a massive drop, but that drop is probably attributed a lot to how powerful Flutter Mane is, and of course the ban of Annihilate probably didn't help too. I'm not sure exactly when the ban of Annihilate was it around January, maybe beforehand, but I do remember at launch Fighting being extremely prevalent. However, it did really fall off. For me, the worst part about this trend is not just that the top 2 types really haven't changed in the last few months. It's the fact that the gap gets wider and wider between the lower tiers and the top tiers. We're seeing even more usage of the things like Ghost and Dark than we did back in January, and I think with no intervention that really wouldn't change a lot. I'm kind of surprised Dark isn't used more as a counter to Ghost, but again, Ghost has such fantastic counters now with things like Mimikyu, Flutter Mane. It had Annihilate, thankfully that's gone because that really made it scarier, but even still it can definitely hold its own against the Dark matchup, which is why Dark hasn't seen complete domination just yet. There are 2 other major factors as to why I think the meta remains stagnant, and that's due to the lack of activity with regards to bans, suspects, or anything new of note being fed into the meta. Since the beginning of the generation, we've had a small handful of bans, but nothing amazingly worth noting, just things that were kind of obviously going to be banned because of insane levels of power creep, but even at that, I think a lot has slipped through the cracks all the same. But that said, the thing worth note of ban, I think, was the ban of terrestrialization, which I am in the first place quite mixed on, especially given the reasoning behind the ban, which I don't necessarily agree with. Do I think it's inherently healthy for the meta? I don't know, though I do think it was definitely a very unique selling point for the meta, and something that differentiated this from other monotypes or even from Generation 9 Natdex itself in mostly a good way. I think Monotype is not the most competitive meta in the first place. I think it's never going to be the most balanced meta in the first place, and I think terrestrialization deserved at least a little bit more time before it got banned, and let's see how the meta developed with it instead of banning it so early. But that's not here nor there. I don't necessarily agree with every decision some other councils like the OU council make, though I do think it's a very active meta, and I think they will do a good job of keeping the meta quite fresh, at least from a casual side of things. I'm a casual enjoyer and player of OU, and I think it keeps relatively fresh all the same. I am all for things being suspected, or even banned and later unbanned if the case calls for it. I just think in the short lifespan this generation has become fairly unplayable and very stale, to the extent that I have lost passion for it outside of NatDex. The other big issue, which I mentioned briefly there, is the double-edged sword of the existence of NatDex monos. NatDex monos came very shortly after Generation 9 was released, unlike in Generation 9 where I believe it took over a year to come out. I think that let Generation 8 develop a bit more, for better or worse, because Generation 8 was all the same probably much worse state than Generation 9 is at launch. It was very, very bad. As I explained in an earlier video, the idea of Pasho Berry Stonejourner was genuinely being thrown around because rock players were desperate for counters to water types. It was a dark time to be a monotype player, but we still enjoyed it because the meta evolved at a fairly healthy pace, and I don't think there was other metas necessarily drawing away from it. Now, personally, I absolutely love the NatDex monotype. I think it's far more enjoyable than Generation 9. However, I do think having the two is definitely a good thing, but I also believe it cannibalizes some of the player base. I do know a lot of players who have completely stopped playing Generation 9. The meta doesn't even develop much because a lot of players don't feel the need or want to develop it, because Generation 9 NatDex is there instead. We have some stats here for Generation 9 NatDex, and they are by no means perfect. We still do not have the 5.5% average I would love to see in a meta, but again, I don't believe that will ever happen. However, we can see here the most used type, my Bugbear Mono Steel, only hit 8.09%, which really isn't that bad, especially when we compare it to the 12.25% in Mono Ghost. That almost 4% difference is quite significant, given the fact, again, the average is 5.5%. That's not a huge difference off that. As well as that, the top three types obviously dominate, being Steel, Bug, and Normal, with Water and Electric following closely behind, but that's okay because there's not a huge difference in them. There's never a massive jump in 1% pretty much between any types, unless you look down here at the bottom types between Ice and Grass, where there's almost a 1% drop rate, but that's only in the two least used types, and again, that's just natural. There's going to be bottom tier types in pretty much any game or anything that's competitive. There's going to be better and worse tools to use. It's just nice to see these worse tools are still somewhat usable and not a million miles off the better types we have here. For that alone, I think it's not a perfect meta, but it's definitely in a lot healthier state. I think it's also in a lot more active state. We see a lot more bans, a lot more Pokemon come in, and I think the release of Generation Home is also going to help Generation 9 NatDex. All of what I've said are the points or the flaws in Generation 9, but the real question is, will Home save monotypes? The answer to that is, I don't know, and time will tell. I'm certainly looking forward to trying the new meta, and I think it can't honestly get any worse, but as I briefly touched on there, I think Home is also going to shake up Generation 9 NatDex a lot because of the release of Hisuian forms. I think things like Dragon with Hisuian Gudra, Rock with Hisuian Arcanine, Scyther, the Cleaver guy, I think, for Bug and Rock, we could see some decent usage of things like that. So, will I ultimately go back to playing Generation 9? I'm not sure, but I hope it's going to be more playable. I think Generation 9 NatDex is also going to be a lot better as well. The final question I want to address in this video is, people have asked me, is Monotype dead? Personally, I don't think so. Unfortunately, from what I've seen a lot of players fall out of love with the tier, and a lot of players stop playing altogether in recent times, which is quite understandable. I would be sitting here lying to you if I said that sometimes I didn't feel the same, that the spark and the passion I once had for Monotype seems to be dwindling, but I don't think that's necessarily always going to be the case. I think I've played the tier a lot. I really enjoy what I do here on the channel, so I'll definitely keep doing it. I just think breath of fresh air, a bit of life being breathed into this tier, at least for a few months, will keep things very interesting, will reignite my passion. I'm really looking forward to using new Pokemon, and to be honest, by the time I finish making videos for Generation 9, at the release schedule of Pokemon, Generation 10 probably won't be too far behind. And failing that, I do think NatDex will always be a fun alternative, as well as that there's other ways to play Monotype. I've been working on Monotype playthroughs recently in Pokemon Red and Pokemon Gold that hopefully I want to bring to the channel as live streams pretty soon, so I've promised it for a long time on the channel, but I think of a new format that I can work it relatively well given my work schedule and my upload schedule, so hopefully in the near future you'll see that, and I have big plans for my anniversary. If I can get them done in time, I will hopefully see you all there. I really look forward to it. I look forward to the future of Monotype in general. I look forward to the future of my channel, and if you made it this far, thank you so much for supporting me. It means a lot. If you leave a like, comment, subscribe on the video, all that kind of good stuff, it really helps me out as a small creator. I appreciate it. Hopefully you're all looking forward to the Pokemon Home update as much as I am. I'll catch you next time, everyone, and take care.